Welcome back to another episode of the Brawn Body Podcast, proudly sponsored by Isophit. Isophit is my go-to for all things isometric strength training and allows you and your team and clients and athletes, pretty much everyone that you work with, to win more and hurt less. For more on Isophit, you can check the description below. Today I'm joined by Dr. Brian Hunter and Dr. Rayce Houser. The three of us are going to be diving into overhead athletes and baseball in particular. We cover a lot of ground from constraint-based exercise to elbow injuries and so much more. We cover so many amazing topics and points across the hour 10 minutes that we chat today. I know you're going to love this episode. Be sure to share it with someone who could benefit from hearing the information that we discussed today. And also, if you could leave a 5-star review on the podcast below, it really helps us go out there and be able to reach more people and have a broader impact on the world. Enjoy. Brian, Rayce, welcome to the podcast. Super excited to work with you guys today. Thank you so much for being here, guys.
Yeah, man. Thanks for
Thank
having
you,
us
man.
on.
For people
This
who
is an
might not
honor.
be familiar with the two of you, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and all the amazing stuff you do?
Yeah, sure. Well, Dan, thanks for having me, man. This is my first official real podcast appearance, so hopefully knock it off with a good hot debut here. So currently a PT up in Eldersburg with True Sports PT. I got a decent baseball background, so played some college baseball from 2010 to 2014. Ended up getting drafted my senior year. Played from 2014 to 2018 with the Reds organization as a pitcher. Decided to make the big boy decision to hang up the cleats and go back to school. Ended up being a good decision. Went back to PT school 2019 to 2022. Started up with True Sports in May of 22. So just passed actually yesterday was my 2-year anniversary. But yeah, so that's where I'm at now. Been with them for 2 years. Currently do a bunch of online training, in-person training for baseball stuff outside of PT. Work with several high school, college, and a couple pro guys still. Yeah, so just keeps me involved in the game. I work primarily, I would say probably over 50% of my caseload right now in the clinic is baseball, but see athletes all over the spectrum. So field sport athletes, even active adults. I really, really enjoy working with shoulders in particular. Elbow kind of comes with the nature of treating baseball guys, but I find myself gravitating more towards just really enjoying treating shoulders in general. But I know we're going to talk some elbow today, so I'm getting ready.
Sweet. So I can't quite compare with Brian in terms of being a elite athlete. I was a good D3 athlete who could compete in multiple sports, but I could never excel in just one sport. So essentially graduated PT school in 2021. From there, ended up doing an orthopedic residency with University of Maryland, Baltimore. Finished that in 2022. And then essentially since then, I'd worked with True Sports up until April 2024. I recently just moved back to the Pacific Northwest. So I'm back in Portland, Oregon, and I'm currently working for a company called Roke. And at this point now, I'm largely working with probably 50 to 60% overhead athletes, majority being probably like high school baseball and softball athletes.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I mean, the two of you combined have great experience here, from Brian's professional career and clinical career to Rayce, your clinical career, and just the overall drive and ambition that you have from a clinical standpoint. I don't know how many hours you put in per week to like studying stuff and researching stuff and learning new stuff, but I think it's a freaking lot. Brian, I gotta say, I'm a little upset I don't have your autograph still, dude. If you could get that card sent over to me, I'd appreciate it.
I'm working on it. I'm working on it. It's
You
in the
both
mail.
you both brought up amazing points on overhead athletes, and it's interesting because I hear that term get thrown around a ton. Everyone's like, "Oh yeah, I work with overhead athletes," or "Yeah, I really like shoulders and overhead athletes." But then I ask them what an overhead athlete is, and they kind of look at me funny. They're like, "Well, it's, like baseball or it's like softball." But I think that term can encompass more than just one or two sports. Is that right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, those
Right.
two obviously being sorry, Rayce. It's like we need a buzzer here, right? No, I would say those two are the most obvious ones, right? Are throwing athletes, but we got to look at tennis, we got to look at javelin, we got to look at CrossFit, we got to look at anybody doing Olympic lifting, anything where they're loading up overhead. I mean, the first ones that come to my head are obviously baseball, softball, the throwing sports per se, but I'm gonna lump in like any sort of overhead lifting in that as well. I mean, my location, we're inside a CrossFit gym, and I can't tell you how many CrossFit athletes I see come in with shoulder pain.
Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add there. Brian pretty much killed that there. So I would essentially just reiterate what Brian said there.
So what makes someone who works overhead unique, right? Whether it's throwing or just overhead pressing a lot from like CrossFit, strongman, whatever that way. What makes that overhead movement, overhead motion unique? Why do we see so many issues with that in your opinions?
I think some of it stems from the intricate play of everything that's going on, the number of joints that are implicated in this motion. When we're looking at the shoulder joint complex, we have AC joints, sternoclavicular, scapulothoracic, glenohumeral. Also have the various joints in terms of like costovertebral. So we start thinking about that, and we could even go into cervical spine as well. We start thinking about all those joints that are moving in this sort of overhead motion. There's a lot of things that could theoretically go wrong, or theoretically cause some sort of dysfunction down the chain. And that can be the hard part at times, is trying to understand, like, if we're having pain in the shoulder, is it truly a shoulder issue, or is it potentially stemming from somewhere else?
Yeah, I think that's spot on as well. Yeah, I think that just the shoulder being so far away from the ground, and like how much force needs to come through the body at some point to then um, come through the hand or the upper extremity to produce force, whether that's throwing or pressing or handstand walks or whatever it may be. Yeah, there's just such an intricate balance between all the joints involved and how many muscles attached to the actual inside the glenohumeral joint or the scapulothoracic joint. It's a really complex joint with the least amount of stability in any joint in the body, but allows the most degrees of freedom. And yeah, just it opens up the door for a plethora of things to kind of become problematic. Um, but yeah, it's fun trying to get down to the nitty gritty and figuring out, okay, is this like Ray said, is this actually a shoulder issue, or we need to start looking at the C spine or T spine or even hips. It's fun, but it's challenging.
Yeah, you both bring up such an interesting point on the anatomical considerations, because you're right, the joint itself is very unstable, right? Me, who's not flexible and never stretches, can do this and get, 170, 180 degrees of overhead movement. Meanwhile, I'm struggling to get my hips past like 120. And it's the same joint, it's ball and socket. But the joint itself definitely allows for so much movement. And you're right as well, Rayce, in the multitude of joints that are present here, because some of that is glenohumeral, but some of it comes from those contributions at AC, at ST, at all the other joints. And I think it's so funny when we talk about overhead athlete, because everyone goes right to the shoulder, right to the glenohumeral joint, but we kind of forget about all those other things, so much so that a lot of PTs and clinicians just never even assess those other joints, because they're like, well, it's a shoulder thing, so shoulder it is. And it's interesting as well. You brought up the hip, Brian. I've had a couple athletes come into me for shoulder, but everything started with hip pain, or their hip was giving them issues, or we had a hip labrum tear or FAI or something like that. And next thing you know, we now have shoulder issues. So it's really interesting when you start to kind of dive into like the sling systems between glute and lat and so on that way, just how interconnected everything is. And realistically, I don't think we can say we just work with shoulders or elbows with overhead athlete. In reality, we kind of end up treating the whole body, because it all plays into what we see there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. Like I like three examples popped in my head when you mentioned the hip injuries. Like I had a buddy I played with who he suffered he had, whether it was left or right first, I forget, but he had a one hip labrum torn, got it repaired, came back the following year, got his other hip labrum repaired, ended up with Tommy John the following year, came back, was healthy again. His first outing back from Tommy John, retore, and then on his way back from that ended up tearing his lat. So like you said, kind of just starting at the hip. He had a tough journey, obviously. On top of some other stuff, he's doing great now. He's killing it. But he's he's out of baseball, but he's doing great otherwise. But yeah, it starts with it. Like for him, like it's almost a guarantee that you start at the hip there. If he's not able to internally rotate, whether he's loading or landing, especially on his plant leg as a pitcher, it ends up having to spread force and disperse forces elsewhere, and have him sort of compensate to make up for his inability to maybe decelerate or continue decelerating into release.
I'd probably just kind of piggyback off that. Like, I think we look at a lot of PTs, like they probably don't understand like the intricacies of throwing, of pitching. And so if they're getting someone coming in to their clinic, either shoulder pain or elbow pain, most commonly they're probably going to look at that joint specifically. And then you may have some other PTs who might consider looking at, C-spine, T-spine, but that might be it. And like when we start looking at like, when it comes to pitching, like I need that lead leg block. How is their like trunk or essentially like their shoulder hip separation? If we look at elbow flexion extension range of motion, looking at cervical rotation, like the list just starts to kind of go on and go on. And if all you ever look at is just the upper extremity, like you're probably most likely missing a decent size piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, definitely. And Rayce, I got to give you credit. I'm pretty sure it was you who made this post, or it might have been your other page, Rehab Renaissance, I think it is. But I think it was you made the post about overhead athletes at one point and about the demands of throwing and just how much force goes through the arm, when we are throwing. And like you even brought up the lat and the lat injury there, Brian. I mean, we think about the size of the lat anatomically, especially if you've seen it on like a cadaver study, and think that all the force from that is going through this joint here. It's absolutely crazy to me. And we think about how unstable it is, the forces that are in play here to throw a ball 100 miles an hour over and over and over again. And it's like almost a matter of no wonder why injury is going to occur. In fact, it might not be a question of if, but a question of when it would occur if we did that enough.
Yeah, and Brian may have some additional numbers on this. But if we take a pitch that's between like 70 to 80 miles an hour, in terms of like the internal rotation speed, like angular velocity, we're looking at like 6,000 to 8,000 degrees per second. I forget what that comes out to like in terms of revolutions, but I think it's like 20 or something. Like it's pretty ridiculous. And then if we look at in terms of like arm deceleration for that same sort of velocity of pitch, the force is going through the shoulder, it's like up to like 275 pounds of force. And just like this is not just one pitch, like this is over and over and over, and it could be upwards of 100 pitches potentially in a game. And then put on top of that, we have additional throwing throughout the week, potentially multiple starts in a week. So these sort of forces, if we don't have the internal kinetics in terms of like strength, capacity, all these things, essentially there's like this mismatch of like where they're at based off what that load is being placed upon them.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like laughable. It's like you start thinking about, we talk about, Dan, I know you talk about underloading a fair bit, and I kind of giggle when it comes to some more traditional approaches to baseball rehab when it comes to the shoulder. But like Ray said, we're talking about up to 8,000 degrees per second of angular velocity and 2 times body weight distraction force at release. And it's like you're going to tell me a red TheraBand external rotation is going to prepare you for that. It's like you got to rethink maybe a little bit, or that a pitcher shouldn't overhead press, or you shouldn't do pull-ups or hang from a bar. And I think at that point you're severely underserving the population. When you hear those numbers, it just kind of puts it in perspective. Like throwing is unbelievably stressful, and then like Ray said, you tack on volume, acute and chronic volume on top of that, and it's just these guys and girls have to be so physically prepared to do this day over day and not suffer an injury.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a point I know Rayce and I have talked about extensively in the past, right? Where a lot of people get so caught up in the asymmetries between left versus right. And it's like, well, this one externally rotates 20 degrees more. And it's like, well, yeah, it's their throwing arm. They're a pitcher. That's the one that they throw with. there's going to be changes from a mechanic standpoint. There's changes within the joint structure itself based on the research I've seen that evolve after 15, 20 years of playing a sport like this, of throwing a ball for 15, 20 years. The body literally changes in response to those stresses that we put on it. And it's the kind of thing where we can't just sit back and treat asymmetries here, because the sport itself requires us to be asymmetrical. So we almost have to evolve our understanding of the overhead athlete beyond just picking up on differences between the left versus the right and treating accordingly. We have to dig a lot deeper into that. And as you both just outlined, this is a sport of the extremes, or throwing requires the extremes, extreme forces, extreme speeds, and so on that way. But that's at the shoulder. We talked about the shoulder. Why on earth do we see so many elbow injuries in throwing athletes? Why is it that we see a UCL tear? Or why is it that athletes will come and see one of us and they'll start complaining about pain in the front of the elbow, or in the back of the elbow, or in the inside, or so on that way, when it sounds like most of the stress is at the shoulder itself?
It's further down chain, you know, it's reliant on that shoulder to be stable and strong. And it's again back to the stress of throwing. Like, yeah, our body, we've evolved to be able to throw overhand, but have we evolved to throw overhand at 100 miles an hour? It just comes down to, like, the number one correlation with elbow injuries is throwing volume, then followed by throwing velocity. And the chase right now in baseball is to throw harder and harder and harder. You know, for better or for worse. It's you know, it's if you're not training it right now, you're falling behind, or at least that's the perceived approach right now. So you see everybody else training and everybody's throwing harder, and they're getting offers, or they're getting signed, or they're getting, you know, big contracts. I got to do the same thing to keep up, to keep my opportunity. It's no one likes to be the guy that, you know, the command guy that takes it easy on their arm, and, you know, no one really gives a crap about them anymore. So it lies in the approach there, in my opinion. And again, just like physical preparedness, you know, whether it's metabolic endurance, or whether it's actual physical strength. You know, there's like the famous cadaveric study about the amount of stress it takes to tear a UCL, and it's like something like 34 newtons of force. And granted, yes, that's a cadaver, that's a dead person, but when it comes down to it, like, it doesn't take a lot of force. And that just highlights the importance of the dynamic stability of the flexors and the pronator to stabilize during the throw.
Yeah, and like when we look at throwing, we'll take that same 70 to 80 mile an hour pitch. Like, that valgus torque can be anywhere from like 50 to 70 Newton meters. So like Brian said, it kind of reiterates the importance, one, of like that flexor pronator mass, and then two, kind of being able to disperse force kind of throughout the chain. I think the other thing that kind of comes into play here too is, on top of the physical preparation, is like maintaining that in season. I feel like it's so common for, once people get in season, just to quit lifting, and all they do is just focus on their sport. So now we're, you know, all those sort of things that we improved from like a physical capacity standpoint, we're starting to maybe get some muscle atrophy, lose some of our conditioning. And then two, I think at times we don't do a great job, like more with some of the coaching side of things, of understanding like the stressors of throwing and having a good idea in terms of like workload management.
Yeah, no, I think you'd both hit on some amazing points there. And just to take that last point you brought up there, Rayce, overhead athletes, especially in the middle school, high school age, there's no off season. It's, you play school ball, and then it's summer ball and travel ball. It never stops. And to your point, how often do we have common communication between all of the PTs, strength coaches, parents, athlete, and every coach that's involved in that kid's like development, right? That doesn't happen, right? The high school coach and the travel coach probably aren't talking regularly, under my assumption. So with that in mind, you know, is it possible that a kid plays for one travel team, pitches, you know, hits his pitch limit or whatever that way, and then 2 days later plays for a different team and pitches out there too? I certainly see that happening, and I've heard stories and seen cases of it happening. So now it's, you know, we have the right idea of, we have pitch limits, except we're not actually able to like track them, because we're playing for so many different teams and things are getting lost in the shuffle. And Brian brought up the point that everyone's trying to throw absolute gas right now. And for good reason, right? It's freaking cool to turn on the TV and see guys throwing 100 miles an hour. That was not the standard when I grew up watching baseball. In fact, my favorite pitchers growing up, Mike Pacina, Mariano Rivera, they were all known for just being absolutely filthy with other pitches, knuckle curve or cutter. And that's stuff that, it's still there, but it's just not the same as it used to be, right? I think some of those big name pitchers I remember, like Greg Maddux, they never threw 100 miles an hour, and yet they're Hall of Fame worthy. So there's a shift in the overall sport where now it's almost a requirement to be able to throw gas. Whereas before you could rely on all these other things, overall control and demand, off-speed pitches, breaking ball, and so on that way. And they obviously carried a lot less stress and strain through the arm as a result. So we've got a combination of sport has evolved where now we need kids throwing absolute gas. Plus, we have a situation where kids are constantly playing and no one's in common communication and sharing a common goal for that athlete. And I think that combination, and there's probably other factors as well, certainly sets us up for a major issue in overhead athlete injuries. And I think that's a huge reason, in my opinion, why we see so many 14, 15, 16, 17-year-olds with these like overuse injuries like UCL or labrum and stuff like that when they're still not even fully developed.
One example of a kid I just worked with recently, his first two outings for his pitching, I think he was both right around like 90 pitches. And like, talking to him and asking him questions from like a bullpen standpoint, like he was throwing about 25 pitches per bullpen, maybe a couple times a week. And that was the extent of like his pitching volume. And then, doing fielding drills and warming up with throwing and stuff like, we can include that in there in terms of throwing volume. But in terms of like this very high intent throwing, the most volume he had built up in one essentially outing is 25 pitches. And then he's then asked to go throw, almost 4 times the amount of that in a game. So kind of goes back to Brian's point about that physical prep is like, we haven't built ourselves up to that capacity to be able to handle that sort of workload yet. So it's like we need to do a better job on the front end of being able to sort of build up that, whether it's building out that sort of throwing progression earlier on, or when we're in the season, our outings are limited to a certain pitch count, and then we kind of progress that over the course of the season.
To build off that and what I was going to say before, it's so important to be able to educate the player and the parents. Dan, going off of your point about the communication standpoint, like the common denominator here is the player and the parent, between the coaches, between different teams, and whether it's school or travel or whatnot. It comes down to educating the person who's involved in all of them, and that's parent and player. And it's sad to see sometimes. Obviously, you get some parents who maybe don't quite understand, and some do a really good job. You educate them, and they're bought in. You get other ones who are they're texting you, "Hey, he just pitched yesterday. Can I pitch again today?" And it's like, is this you asking, or is this your son or daughter asking? And it just highlights the importance of like how freaking important it is to have those conversations with them and make sure that it's understood. And that goes on, that the responsibility falls on us to one, be prepared enough and be confident enough to deliver that information and say, listen, no, like I know you think this game is important, but it's not more important than the big picture when it comes to health. Like it might be a playoff game, or it might just be a fall baseball game. It doesn't matter when you zoom out. And it sounds almost I don't know, it sounds maybe a little bit denigrating or defeating, like to kind of or to highlight the unimportance of maybe some games or outings. But you have to have them zoom out and view it from the bigger picture and show them that they don't have to be throwing 4 times a week, or they don't have to play for 2 teams. If someone asks them to go play in a travel tournament in Georgia tomorrow, you don't have to say yes, because you go down there and your son gets hurt, or they're throwing at 80% of their capacity just to go down and throw. It does no one any good. So it's good to have that perspective and highlight that with the player and the parent.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this, because I've always heard that that workload is tracked in pitch count. And this is a discussion I've had with Eric DeGatti and Nate Denning and people like that in the past, where, that's all well and good, but what happens when you're on a travel team where you have a limited number of players, and then after you're done pitching, you move to third base or you move to center field, and now you've got to make a bunch of long throws, across the infield, or 150-foot throws from the outfield, and so on that way, right? Like, it's more than just tracking workload through the pitch count. To your point on the bullpens and that sort of thing, it's also like, what else are we doing? Because if I go out there and throw 80, 90 pitches, and now I've got to hit, 12 long throws from the outfield, am I still really resting per se by switching positions? Or am I just adding more and more load and strain on top of that?
Well, I'm like thinking potentially too, like if I'm someone in the outfield who's playing, like I'm trying to host someone out at home, like to me, like have you seen like the traditional like pull downs where like people are just trying to like absolutely just yank a ball and try to like hit PRs on the gun? So like that's what I sort of envision in terms of like I'm in center field, I got to make a play at home, try to get a runner out. Like that's that throw, and a lot of times those can be at a higher velocity than what we're actually seeing from the mound. So like you said, Dan, like these sort of additional stressors are accumulating, and they're usually factors I feel like we don't take into consideration.
Yeah, it's just like any sport. Like as a sports PT, you got to have a really solid background in the demands of that sport, and those are the nuances that need to be considered with something as stressful as throwing. Especially the younger ages where your best pitcher is probably your best shortstop or your best center fielder or your best catcher, and Timmy's going from throwing 60 pitches on Fridays, catching Saturday morning, and coaches sometimes don't see that as stress. And again, back to the education component, that's where player mom and dad need to have a really good understanding of that. And throwing is stress, and just because they're not on a mound pitching or throwing as hard as they can doesn't mean that their chronic workload is not taking a hit. So I mean, it's extremely important to consider, and that's where it gets frustrating sometimes as a PT, and having the background that I have, having played and coached and trained, that the barrier to entry sometimes for coaching is in my opinion a little bit too low, especially with regards to arm care and health. Sometimes these coaches just really prioritize whether it's winning or whether it's just like they just don't know. Like I would like to believe that a lot of them, it's not malevolent in nature, but I think some just truly don't care. It's like, can we bring home that $8 trophy at the end of the tournament and call ourselves national champions? And sometimes they sacrifice the health of their players for that. But again, the common denominator once again is the player and the parents, just educating them on, listen, yeah, I know you want to play as much as possible. I know you want to pitch. I know you want to catch. I know you want to play short, but take a step back and understand that you gotta consider those as stress as well.
Definitely. And as we mentioned, there's not really a true off season for a lot of these athletes. And Rayce brought up the point earlier about the importance of in-season management. And I think we've all seen it where, athletes in season, it's like, well, I'm too busy. So they stop lifting and they stop doing all their little work that they put in the off season, and they just play sport and then go home and sleep and play video games or something. And that in-season work, I feel like for the overhead athlete is absolutely crucial. And you brought up the flexor pronator mass, you both did, and the importance of overall forearm strength and offloading the elbow. But it's funny because I feel like the forearm musculature is often forgotten when it comes to arm care programs. I think most teams or most athletes have seen your basic J bands and that sort of thing, and everyone's doing your basic rotator cuff warm up now, which is great. But I almost feel like the forearm musculature is absolutely forgotten about when it comes to the concept of arm care and really strength and conditioning in general. A lot of programs, they do a great job of developing athletes from a compound standpoint, and they do a great job of helping athletes get stronger and more powerful. But then it comes to like foot and ankle, or in this case, forearm training. And a lot of times it's just kind of like put on the back burner and forgotten about.
Definitely. And like you mentioned, Dan, this is one thing that probably gets neglected. I would also even probably include rotator cuff and periscapulars can get neglected at times as well. And similar, like when we start to look at the stress that's happening at the elbow, like just doing like your, not saying these exercises don't have like utility, but like with your plate pinch holds and some of those things. I know we're working a little bit like smaller muscles and those things, but in terms of we have a limited time during this training session, like what sort of things are going to kind of give me my best bang for my buck, and probably something that's going to require a lot of gripping. I'm thinking like heavy pull-ups, heavy hangs, farmer's carries that are heavy. Like those are probably going to be some of the better muscles or some of the better movements to be able to really train that sort of flexor pronator mass. And we look specifically in terms of kind of what two muscles are more kind of overlying the fibers of the UCL. Typically is like FCU and FDS. So the gripping one's going to largely work FDS. So if we want to supplement some other, ulnar deviation stuff, we can also incorporate, just means in terms of using like a hammer or Indian club and do like pronation, supination exercises. I think we need to do a better job just in general in terms of understanding like these are demands. How do I best bridge that gap and be able to implement some of these sort of exercises to help develop some of those physical capacities, especially when it pertains to the elbow, wrist, hand.
Yeah, agreed. I think the again, like moving big rocks, especially when you're from a training economy standpoint, when you're crunch for time in season, is super important. Where obviously your grip stuff's going to come in with heavier loading with a barbell or with some dumbbells and stuff like that. I think another thing to consider with that is like training them with the same intent that you would train any other muscle, like different lengths, different speeds. And that's something that I think overall as a profession that could be done better, especially when it pertains to throwing athletes in specific, is that like, yeah, I can do, heavier gripping exercises, or I can do dead hangs, but am I getting those muscles to change length at different varying speeds and with different loads? And, again, we've highlighted, I think, ad nauseum so far about how stressful throwing is, but if I don't ever get my pronator lengthened, or I don't ever get my pronator lengthened under higher speeds, it might be underprepared, especially over the course of the season. We know that like two things are for sure going to happen over the course of a season as a player in general, specifically pitchers. You're going to get tight and you're going to get weaker, right? That chronic workload is going to come into play. Like whether it's pronator gets super tight and we gets all knotted up there, or whether it's lat gets tight, we start losing overhead motion, or cuff starts to get worn down over the course of the season. Those are all things that need to be addressed in between outings, in between bullpens, and even just with like a standard arm care program. Like how can we maintain full range of motion, and how can we maintain strength as best we can with respect to overall workload?
Yeah, and you brought up a great point on, the concept of training the forearm musculature that way. And, as Rayce mentioned, you can apply that same concept to other areas like your periscapular as well. We tend to train it all in the same way, right? For periscapular, I think most PTs go right to like the Blackburn progression. Or, if you look at general arm care routine, Blackburn progression is really easy to just throw at a whole team, and it's better than nothing. And I gotta say, I would rather kids do Blackburns than nothing. But there's a lot more to it than just basic ITY. Same thing with the forearm. It's very easy to just grip heavy stuff. It's also really easy to grip different things. When I was in high school back in the day, I took two baseballs, drilled a hole through them, and put an eye bolt through it and hung it on my pull-up bar. And I was like, I felt all sports specific because I was gripping a baseball instead of the pull-up bar, right? That's very easy, low-hanging fruit stuff. But to really take it to another level, as Brian mentioned, and as you mentioned, Rayce, we really need to be able to hit it at varied speeds, at varied intensities, and understand the underlying forces. It's great that we can hit a heavy type of hold contraction or a heavy isometric, like a real slow force type of thing there. But what about a fast force, right? When's the last time you've seen someone do like rapid eccentrics that involve the hand and elbow complex? Like that's just not a thing. What kind of stuff do you guys go to as far as training that elbow complex and these forearm musculature? Where does your head go from a training standpoint as far as hitting high force and fast force and all of those other type of force considerations with this musculature that might often get missed?
So first thing I go to, or first thing that I think of, and this is more like indirectly kind of getting at them, is more of your typical like upper extremity plyometrics with like plyometric push-ups. The one thing I hate seeing when people perform it is I feel like when they get too close to being like in a full extended position, they don't end up getting like full wrist flexion. Like all they do is just like stop short and just like essentially extend the shoulder or elbow. And like once they're there, they end up getting off the ground. So we don't ever get that full wrist excursion. So like when I'm thinking like on the land, if I'm in a more like flex position and then almost like the foot and the ankle, like when I start to like load that tendon, like I'm trying to train those sort of tendons that attach on like that medial forearm to be able to sort of withstand that sort of impact, that sort of quick loading. We're gonna get some load under very fast conditions. And then you can always adjust that sort of progression. Whether you want to have it be more potentially med ball based, get a little bit lighter loading that way. You might get a little bit more of a speed component depending on like how far you're dropping the ball from or how high you're dropping the ball from. If you have access to like a super cat, that could be another easy means to be able to train some of those like forearm wrist sort of muscles and tendons under like high velocity conditions.
I've never used a super cat, but I've wanted to use one so bad. They look so sick. Yeah, no, I just to go off of what Ray said, I think those are all spot on. I love upper extremity plyos. I think they are something that gets again like kind of neglected when it comes to training overhead athletes, which seems almost counterintuitive. But I think with the traditional, maybe old school approach to baseball was like do no harm. You got the old school guys who just, hey, let's run poles and take it easy, and that's pretty much it. And I think they kind of are taken aback by some of the new, more modern training methods, and they might be quick to maybe attribute to some of those towards the higher injury rates. For whether they're right or wrong, who knows? But yeah, I mean, when it comes to training force and speeds through the elbow, through the hand and wrist complex, like Ray said, I like doing something like a even light, like a med ball dribble with like an emphasis on the fingers, kind of like getting some length through through the fingers and dribbling down towards the ground, or maybe take that to a wall and do like a little modified wall pogo with the fingers and wrist. And then even something just like an overspeed where you have a player or you have a patient holding like a PVC pipe and you have them start in a neutral wrist and you're just kind of throwing them into supination and have them whip it back into pronation, where it's something simple. You don't need to load them super heavy in that regard, but it's getting that pronator to lengthen like overspeed eccentric and then have to fire really quickly on the rebound. Just all little different maybe variations or ideas to mix in to just add a little bit more variability to the training when it comes to the forearm muscles.
Yeah, no,
So,
go ahead.
okay, I have one other thing. I feel like this is kind of almost like hearsay in the baseball world a little bit is Olympic lifting, and people will use that sort of risk reward essentially reasoning as a rationale for not doing it. Like I think it depends on the athlete, their skill level, how much time you potentially have to like build out the sort of the skill for doing that movement. But like when I'm thinking if they're doing a power clean and we're in this more of like neutral position, and then when I go to catch the bar, like I'm now getting into this rapid extended position. Same thing if I'm doing maybe like some sort of a jerk motion where I'm probably in a more extended position to start, and then when I go to press, I probably end up locking out a little bit more. Like I think those can be other indirect means to kind of get at some of that sort of more high force, high velocity loading.
And on that point as well, too, that's a great way to train power transfer from lower body to upper body, which I don't know about you guys, but that's something I have always sucked at myself. I feel like it's like a guy thing. We just don't know how to use our hips. And then once we figure it out, then it's like, how does that go all the way up here? So I certainly think that there's a great time and a place for that as well, just from the overall athlete development standpoint. So I think
I've
that's
seen you dance. I've seen you dance, Dan. I've seen you dance on those TikToks. I believe you can't move those hips very well.
anything.
That's right. Patient first.
Yes, patient first. My pride last. But I find the other piece to that too is it sometimes we do the right things, but it's how we do them. I had this talk with a girl just a couple weeks ago in reference to the trap bar deadlift, and the way she was gripping the bar made the limiting factor her finger flex Yeah, finger flexors. Her finger strength was the limiting factor. And I changed her wrist position a little bit so the handle rested in a different spot, and it was like a night and day difference. So sometimes actually sweating those small things, it's so easy, and I'm guilty of it myself to just throw more weight on there. But sometimes when we actually look at the intricate details of the movements that we're already doing, just changing how we do them, something as simple as where the hand is when we deadlift or where the hand is when we do a pull-up can actually make a huge difference for athletes um, that way. So I think that we can change that and make the hand work harder to grip, or make it a lot easier so we're actually able to load a lot more weight just by changing position as well. Is there any other major concepts or principles that outline your approach to elbow rehabilitation, or anything else that you feel that clinicians often miss in the world of rehabbing the elbow in overhead athletes?
I mean, I think for me, what maybe I have a little bit of an edge on with the background I have is just assessing the throwing motion as well. And this isn't something that I think every PT needs to be able to do in great detail, but I think there's some big rocks to move with regards to movement and with regards to load. So like now, like one of the first questions I ask when a kid comes in with an elbow injury is, what did your ramp up look like? How much have you been throwing? Are you doing some sort of like weighted ball training? And not to demonize weighted ball training, I had a lot of success with myself. I still use it with guys I train for those that are appropriate. But I can't tell you how many kids that come in and say, "Yeah, you know, I have a set of plyo balls," and I'm like, "All right, great. Like, what are you doing with them?" And they're like, "Yeah, I don't know." And it's like, okay, like let me guess, you're just following the drive line like 101, the first video that comes up on YouTube. You're doing pivot picks, you're doing reverse throws, you're doing roll-ins, you're doing walking lineups. Yep. Okay, cool. So I think though they're a double-edged sword, right? Weighted balls are something that we need to definitely ask about, we need to be aware about, because again, throwing is throwing. And I'm gonna make a anytime I need to, I'm gonna make a bet that these kids are probably not doing them appropriately if they're not being monitored at least, or at least following a decent program. So you take some sort of mechanical fault, and then you start compounding that over a course of a season, and then layering on overload throwing with shitty throwing mechanics, and it's not helping anybody. It's doing more detriment. So something to tackle there, and then assessing the throwing motion in general. To again, we got to be cognizant of where we are in season, right? Am I going to try to revamp someone's throwing motion in general? Probably not. But are there gross mechanical deficits that they're showing me when I ask to see a video of them throwing, or I have them throw in the clinic, that we can identify and maybe tackle without much intervention. I'm looking more so to do that in an off season where we have the luxury of not having to compete and face hitters. But if it comes down to it in season, someone's just they're landing at front foot strike wide open with their torso, and they're wondering why their elbow's way far behind their torso, and they're missing arm side and their elbow's hurting them. It's like, okay, well, there's some low hanging fruit for us to tackle. So that's my approach is definitely heavily targeting throwing mechanics in general and throwing workload, aside from the obvious training and loading standpoint.
So yeah, I'll piggyback off that. Now that I'm in my new clinic and stuff, I've definitely been going down that rabbit hole a little bit more with some of my athletes, providing some sort of like throwing constraint drills, to really potentially get at, like, if I see like they're just have a whole lot of like hip shoulder separation that we're not getting, can I try to devise some sort of a throwing task for them to like take the lower half out and see if we can't get at some of those qualities that maybe might help disperse force differently. And then usually where my mind goes, I feel like I tend to be more of a generalist in terms of like physical prep, is when we start looking at introducing upper extremity plyos for the overhead athlete. I feel like we always get stuck at our sort of like drop and catch drills with like the, I don't know, 3,000 gram ball, or it's something that's like 2 pounds of weight and it's like super light, not very fast conditions. We'll do it for like T's, Y's, prone 90-90 ER. We'll do like the light little like ER, IR dribbles on the wall and stuff. And I definitely think they have a time and a place in terms of the rehab process. But I think we start looking at when we get further out into their like throwing progression, we need to start understanding like to beat a dead horse, essentially the demands of throwing. So then it becomes like, how can I start to devise exercises to try to get at, loading the posterior cuff in a very meaningful way. It's going to be high force, high velocity conditions. How can I try to load the intro rotators in the same manner? Bicep, pecs, lats, like etc. To hopefully be able to handle more of that sort of physical stress that they're going to encounter during sports.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And as you mentioned, the end of the day, we have to have an understanding of throwing. We have to understand mechanics. We have to understand the forces in the body that result from them. But this is an area where I feel like we as clinicians, or at least I've found myself guilty of this, I sometimes feel like I have to correct everything and change everything. And in a sport like baseball, I feel like that's a very dangerous thing because you've got individuals who are spending thousands and thousands of dollars for input, from pitching coaches and travel coaches and, pro guys and that sort of thing. And sometimes they have a better understanding of the throwing motion than I might. And that might not be the same case for someone like Brian, who is the guy who's working with them from a pitching coach and development standpoint. But I find sometimes this is an area where I need to almost work more with their pitching coach than with them individually to try and understand the evolution, the cues they're using, and different things of that sort, as opposed to just trying to go at this whole thing with Lone Ranger mentality.
That's a good point, Dan. I think too. Yeah, like so you absolutely need to be communicating with coaches and pitching coaches to again like kind of address the workload standpoint. But if you do identify something that you think needs to be addressed from a throwing motion standpoint, um, having someone you trust is really important. That's going to take a lot um, it's going to take a really open-minded pitching coach to say, okay, like this PT's contacting me with some input on their throwing motion, like let me listen, because you're going to run into a lot of people thinking like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and so on and so forth. I run into it myself, like, and this player, if we don't communicate with their coaches, this player is going to their coach and saying, yeah, my PT told me I need to do X, Y, Z, and if I'm not coach, I'm probably going to even be a little bit like closed-minded to that as well. Like, who is this guy? And that's where the relationship building comes into place, and earning that trust with both the patient, the parents, and the coaches is so ridiculously important. And again, like you said, it's a very finicky thing to start to alter, whether it's a throwing mechanic thing or so on and so forth. You can really open up a can of worms, especially in the game of baseball, where there's a lot of time to think, and you get a young kid who's impressionable, and you think, oh, I can help this kid, and I can give him this drill, I can have him fix this, and next thing you know, their head's spinning on the mound, and they can't put a ball anywhere near the zone. It's just something to kind of navigate from a performance standpoint too. And I know Rayce does an awesome job with his constraints led approach, and maybe being less verbal cueing and more, okay, how can I put this player in a position where they could feel what they need to do correctly and approach it that way? That's kind of making its round in baseball training right now, and I think it's a really good movement, because you're hearing all. I heard it my whole life coming up. You have pitching coaches here or high school coaches there that you got to keep your head on target. You're pulling your shoulder open, or get your elbow higher, or land here, and it's like there's no way at that speed that you're going to be able to check all those boxes and keep your head on straight. Like you have to, when you start consciously thinking about what your body's doing in space, there's no way that you're going to be competitive on the mound. So how do I approach this intervention of addressing some sort of mechanical deficit in the least invasive way possible would be a really good approach. And I think the constraints led approach is the best way, at least that I've heard of so far, to do so.
And heck, I know examples of sometimes where so one of the kids at Pacific came in throwing like 90 miles an hour, but definitely had some mechanical deficiencies in his pitching motion. So pitching coach was like, okay, let's see if we can't maybe make some tweaks, see if we can't make him more efficient from a throwing perspective. And his velo dropped probably 5 miles an hour, maybe up to 8. So, this kid went from throwing 90 mile an hour with technically like inefficient mechanics, and then now we get him technically moving better, but now he's moving, or now he's throwing with less velocity. So it comes back the following year. Pitching coach has him just go back to his what he was doing previously. Comes back throwing 90 miles an hour again, and that's where the art I think comes in a little bit. Is like, you have to pick and choose your battles, and I don't think even myself included like know exactly when these sort of my biomechanical deficiencies are actually helping their performance versus potentially taking away from it. And it's going to be a situation where, let's say you're trying to improve X, Y, and Z, and we see a big drop in velo. And, over this sort of period of time, because I want to get them accustomed to that mechanics, have a big learning effect here. If still we're not seeing any sort of like improvement in velo, there's probably something from like from the deficiency standpoint that was actually helping their performance. And then, we can really relate this to really any task in terms of potentially sprint mechanics, jump mechanics, etc. In terms of, for some athletes, these deficiencies might actually improve their performance.
Yeah, that's a great point at the end there, Rayce. I mean, I have this thought quite a bit during my clinical days. It's like, if this person moves differently and we see a short-term drop in performance, but I feel long-term it's going to be better for them from a movement competency standpoint, am I okay with that? Let's say, for example, we're working with someone, mid-stage post ACL, and I'm dead set that when we jump, I want no valgus moment. I want everything stacked and aligned, and I'd like to avoid when we just do basic non-counter movement jumps. I don't want to have to rely on the knees coming in. And I do that, and their jump height decreases over an inch. I'm okay with that because we have reconstructed tissue. It's still healing. It's going to be a little less load on that tissue, and long term, it's a better mechanic that I want them want them moving in. But the same principle applies in the overhead athlete. There's times when I might be okay with their velocity dropping up 1 or 2 miles an hour, and we'll get back to it later. But there's also times when it's like, hey, we really need that performance, and us changing things right now in exchange for possible long term might not be in the best interest of the athlete. I know that might sound backwards when you think about it, but this is really a tough area that I feel like we have to walk on very thin ice as far as performance versus long-term movement pattern, because for every athlete I've seen with a improper, quote unquote, improper movement pattern that may or may not contribute to injury, that gets hurt, I've also seen someone thrown that same way for an entire career and not have that injury. So there's too many factors in play for me to really say it's a one size fits all approach here, I feel.
And I think it kind of highlights Brian's point earlier, where I'm probably not going to make these sort of large overhauls in terms of mechanics like in season. We might be able to get away with making a couple kind of minor tweaks that may hopefully and theoretically give us some sort of slight increase in either pitching velo, whether it's command, etc. Whereas, if we have this off season, hopefully we have this sort of long period of time to be able to make some of these changes if we think it's going to be long-term beneficial for the athlete. But then you mentioned, Dan, they finish their season that probably starts, let's say a college kid, for example, they're getting back after Christmas break. They're essentially, quote unquote, in season all the way through probably potentially mid-May to end of May. And then they're hopping right into summer ball, and they're probably finishing that up, sometime probably late July, maybe mid-August. And then now theoretically our off season really is, from September till December essentially. And now we only have this 3-4 month window to really be able to like, make some of these sort of potentially like pitching changes, maybe potentially work on some sort of improvements in some of their capacity. There'll be a little bit of nuance there. I know some summer ball teams are like less, from like a volume standpoint between pitches and games and stuff, it's less intense compared to their programs where it's like you're still in season for the entire summer.
This is a big can of worms. This is we can go so far down this rabbit hole. Yeah, Rayce, you're spot on. Like, and you're lucky if you get a fall. You're lucky if you get a fall to impart these changes we want to have on our athletes, right? Sometimes, you know, the pressure's on from these coaches and these organizations to keep money coming in, and that means fall ball. And really, the only time of year, if any, that I think provides any sort of benefit is if an organization decides to do some sort of college showcase, maybe tour. Maybe they get these kids out for like 3 or 4 weeks through September, October, where they can actually play in front of schools, and that's not very common. So, again, like having that talk with parents, and like, listen, you do not have to play fall ball. It's like playing more baseball might not be the best choice right now, giving them a break. And there's this big argument now in all sports, but baseball I think is probably the number one. Is like, we're playing too much baseball, especially in the warm weather states where people are playing year round, playing legitimately year round. You know, would it be more beneficial to get these athletes exposed to other sports? And again, I don't have the answer to this. Do I think in theory it sounds great, but then you have a kid who's not developing their skill at the same rate as everybody else, and they feel like they're falling behind, but maybe they're developing better athletic traits off the field, playing basketball or playing football. So it's really, really challenging. And then, Dan, to touch on your point before about the complexity of the throwing motion in comparison to like a mid-stage ACL rehab, is like, we know that if we generally stay away from valgus moments during plyo movements early on in the rehab process, like the research is pretty strong there. And there's some pretty strong biomechanical research for the throwing motion, but it's nowhere near as strong as it is for the ACL biomechanical research. So, and that's for several reasons, mainly because of the complexity of the movement. So, you know, you can use 35 examples from big leaguers right now who do things quote unquote wrong, but they're making hundreds of millions of dollars doing things wrong. Who's really wrong? And that's where it takes us as coaches and as physical therapists and as healthcare professionals to like reevaluate, okay, like what are the KPIs that we're using, and are they actual real indicators? Like, I can get someone way stronger in the weight room, and if they're not reflecting that performance on the field, or they're not staying healthy, it's like, my KPIs are probably wrong. So it takes that like self-evaluative approach where the importance is how they're producing and how they are in their health on the field. Those are the two most important factors. And if those are not indicating that your training or your rehab is successful, then we need to reevaluate our approach.
And I feel like the three of us could probably talk about this until we're blue in the face and go on until, instead of it being 2:50 p.m. my time right now, until it's 2:50 p.m. Rayce's time. But I feel like we covered a ton of ground today. Is there anything that you feel we missed, or any other closing thoughts that we had that way?
I think the only thing I might add, and this is kind of goes back to some of the weighted ball stuff, is I think a lot of times when people think of weighted ball training, and this is maybe my assumption is completely off the mark here, but my thought is, I think people imagine people just doing pull downs all the time with the entire spectrum of the weighted balls, you know, and not doing sort of these like sub-max constraint based drills. I kind of relate this to when we look at, you know, plyometrics for the lower extremity, where, you know, typically we build up a very large base of extensive plyos in terms of volume. I feel like we can do the same thing with sort of our constraint based drill with throwing, and, you know, weighted balls can be, you know, a portion of that volume. So it's not like we have to always go out and try to sling and hit PRs with our velo. We can sort of build up this foundation in terms of constraint-based throwing to potentially get at certain desired movement patterns, desired kinematics, and sort of build that sort of foundational base, similar to what we will do with like the lower extremity for plyos.
Rayce, that was like unbelievably well said. I couldn't agree more with that. From all points, I think the general perspective on weighted ball training, I think you're 100% right in that, from especially from the rehab lens, is that like maybe there's a big misunderstanding about how they're implemented, but on the contrary, there are people who don't know how to implement it, whether that be players or coaches, right? There where it is very much velocity driven and you know, PR week after week after week. You know, but they certainly have their place, especially in the submax implementation, where the other end of that too, like from a movement standpoint, has a tremendous benefit. That was like one of the most helpful things that I ever did in my baseball career. like I didn't really go through too much of a weighted ball like velocity development program. I did like basically ran through that twice in my entire career, and it was helpful. It was after I had my UCL reconstruction, and it held up great. Like so, I mean, use myself N as one at the N of one. It's not the strongest case, but the most benefit I had from it was the implementation with regard to movement quality and just like getting more sub max reps to learn how you move and also develop the endurance foundation as well. Like we need to build up the capacity and the tolerance to tolerate the plyometric component of throwing. Like throwing is a plyometric movement, and if we're not, we've talked a lot about throwing too much here today, but we also got to make sure we're throwing enough. Like Rayce, what you said before, preparing that your patient throwing 25 pitch pull pins prior to game one and then throwing 90. It's like he's not physically prepared to do that, and weighted balls can be an option for that, where you're not necessarily throwing off the mound, but you're still throwing and you're still getting the system stressed in a more controlled manner in a controlled environment. But yeah, I think that covers anything that I would have said that we missed. I think we did a good job of highlighting, just generally how we should approach throwers and volume and movement in general. And I don't want maybe some of our perspectives to come off as like people don't do a good enough job. I think we could all obviously do a much better job in general, ourselves included. But it just comes down to like being open-minded enough and self-evaluating, like, okay, am I actually if I want to see this caliber of athlete in my clinic, do I have a good enough background and do I know enough to adequately treat them? And if I don't, that's okay, but you have to evaluate and understand like that's the case. Instead of just, writing it off or maybe neglecting some of these points that we made today. But we all obviously have plenty more to learn, and we're going to continue to do so.
Definitely. Continuing to learn is the name of the game. And I know that someone listening is probably going to want to do just that. And I feel like the two of you are phenomenal resources to learn from. So where can people find you at, on Instagram, or Brian's still on AIM, I think. Where can people find you at online?
So main place I'm active is on Instagram. My handle is the front squat doc. And then you can also find me posting some other stuff on Rehab Renaissance. And then as a little side note, this is less baseball specific, but we're looking to more so Rehab Renaissance, looking to release a few courses, probably sometime midsummer. One's going to be just having a basic understanding of physical principles, knowing what certain physics equations look like, how if we manipulate certain variables, how that changes, our exercise parameters. And then we're looking to also release a course in terms of athletic low back pain, more from like a theoretical and like foundational framework side of things.
Awesome. Yeah. I just deleted my AIM account. I did not open up a TikTok account yet. I don't think I will ever dive into TikTok. Maybe I'm wrong, but
it's phenomenal marketing, dude. Let me just tell you.
I know. I told you. I've seen you dance, man. It works. Yeah, I'm primarily on Instagram as well. My handle is hex _PTP. That is the name of my future clinic. I will be branching out, opening that up in July 1st in Columbia, Maryland. Primarily targeting baseball players, but seeing all sorts of athletes and active adults there. I too will be coming out with a course sometime here soon with True Sports. It's primarily targeted towards overhead athletes, addressing anatomy, subjective history, eval, the whole gamut there. Assessing throwing motion, plenty of exercise videos there to kind of address some of the stuff we talked about today that might be in a little bit of the nitty gritty category of baseball rehab, just to help prepare clinicians to treat some higher level baseball athletes there.
So I'm going to throw a little plug there for people who aren't well versed in the throwing motion. Buy that course. I know Brian's going to do a phenomenal job, like walking through everything shoulder related.
I appreciate it, Rayce. Thanks, man. Yeah, I'm excited for it. It should be out sometime soon. It'll be on the True Sports U, similar with the ACL Master course that I know Tim Stone was on this podcast talking about before as well.
Great. We'll link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch any of that, you can just click there and see what Rayce and Brian are up to. Really appreciate your time today, guys. Thanks for everything.
Appreciate
Thanks,
it, Dan.
Dan.
You guys are legends. This was awesome.